Okay, the three sedras coming this week, this period of the year, Vayeishev, Miketz, and Vayigash. So deal with the episode of Yosef being sold to Egypt by his brothers, and ultimately he's taken as he comes a slave in Egypt, and then a prisoner in Egypt, and then he comes Mishnah Lamelech, assistant king of Egypt, and ultimately there is a so to say the brothers and Yosef come back together, and these three sedras are always identified with Chanukah. The Parshas Vayeishev usually is the Shabbos before Chanukah. Parshas Miketz is usually the Shabbos of Chanukah, and Vayigash is usually the Shabbos of the week in which Chanukah ends. So many ask the question, including the Chassam Sofer, my uncle. They ask the question as to what is the connection between Chanukah and the Mechiras Yosef, particularly Parshas Vayeishev, which is the Shabbos that usually is before Chanukah. And I've discussed it, I think probably many times, and I'm going to discuss it again, and I'm going to go over some of the same answers that I previously gave, but I'll go into more detail, and perhaps along the way, I will suggest new answers. But I think this year will continue, although it'll be like a separate year the next year, but it will deal probably with the same topic, but offering other terutzim as well. Now, I always mention that if not for the fact that my uncle and the Chassam Sofer and others discussed the question, I would not have been too troubled by it. Because after all, the one who instituted the order of the Sedras, certainly the order of the Sedras throughout those who read the Torah throughout the year, was Ezra HaSofer. And now Ezra predated Chanukah. But it's obvious that all those who asked the Kasha understood that there is an association with the Sedra, not just with the events that predate the Takana of Ezra, but even with the events of the future as well. And it's interesting that I heard from my father that there was a tradition in their family that if there is something to evaluate, to consider, a situation that arises that requires a determination of what to do, one should look in the Sedra of the week in trying to find an approach. And I know I've heard many times that the same attitude is part of the Lubavitcher tradition. They would say, have a chof-heh itim la Torah, not just in the literal sense of setting aside time, regular periods of time for learning Torah, but chof-heh itim la Torah is that to base the problems of the day, the situations of the day, on the Sedra of the week. So if it's obvious that if we can seek guidance from the Sedra of the week, and we should seek guidance from the Sedra of the week to determine how we should act, the Sedras of the week have a connection not just with the past events, the events prior to Ezra, but the Sedras of the week are connected with the events that will take place or took place after the time is Ezra as well. Consequently, to ask, what is the connection between Vayeishev, Miketz, and the Yigash with Chanukah is a valid question. Now, one of the answers that I've mentioned in the past is based on an effort to try to understand the Rambam at the end of Hilchos Chanukah. The Rambam at the end of Hilchos Chanukah mentions the Gemara that if a person has a choice, he has one candle, and the choice is to use the candle for a near habayis. And the simple explanation, near beso, the simple explanation of near beso means a near Shabbos, and the near Chanukah and the candle of Chanukah. So near beso takes precedence. Why does near beso take precedence? Why does the Shabbos candle take precedence over the Chanukah candle? After all, the Chanukah candle is a mitzvah Pesumei Nisa. It's a mitzvah of re-experiencing a miracle. And we know how stringent the Pesumei Nisa is. The Chachamim said that to fulfillment of the mitzvah Pesumei Nisa, one is required even to sell his shirt. So to go beg in the doors of houses in order to acquire money for Chanukah candles. Nevertheless, if one faces a choice between their Shabbos and their Chanukah, because the Ner Shabbos was important for Shalom Bayis. The Ner Shabbos gave off light in the house. And because of the Ner Shabbos giving off light in the house, people would not bump into objects. And it created an atmosphere that lend itself to peace in the household. But if you have a household that is completely dark and people are constantly bumping into things, then you're creating an atmosphere that lends itself to fighting in the house, to disputes in the house, to arguments in the house. And especially on Shabbos, Friday night, we want there is a special emphasis on Shalom Bayis, on peace in the household. Consequently, the Ner Shabbos takes precedence over the Chanukah candle. And the Rambam, at the end of Hilchos Chanukah, he mentions this halacha, and in truth, I would have expected him to mention this halacha. He says, Haya, this is the last law in Hilchos Chanukah. Haya lefanav ner beiso v'ner Chanukah. If a person had a choice between the candle of his house which is assumed to mean the candle of Shabbos, the Ner Shabbos, the Ner Chanukah, and the candle of Chanukah. So, or Ner Beso, you have the choice between the Shabbos candle, the Kiddush Hayom, and buying wine for Kiddush, for Shabbos, Ner Beso Kodem. So the candle of the house, the candle of Shabbos, takes precedence. Mishum Shalom Beso, because of the importance that peace in the house has in halacha. Shaharei, because we see Hashem Nimchat Lasok Shalom Beinish Lishto. The name of God is erased to make peace between man and his wife. And we know that by a sota, the parsha of sota was put into the bitter waters, and the writing was erased. And in the parsha of sota, of course, the name of God is mentioned there. And then the Rambam goes on further and he says, Gadol HaShalom, great is peace. Shekol HaTorah nitna laso shalom ba'olam. That the Torah, the two texts in the Rambam, the Torah, or the whole Torah, was given to make peace in the world. Shenema dracheha darkei shalom, darkei noam. Its paths, its paths are paths of its ways are ways of pleasantness. V'chol nisivoseha shalom, and all its paths or roads are peace. So the Rambam here, at the conclusion of Hilchos Chanukah, talks, not only mentions the halacha that the Ner Shabbos is more important because of Shalom Bayis, but he goes into a mini sermon as to the significance of Shalom Bayis in particular, and Shalom peace in general. And the question is, you would have thought that the Rambam at the end of Hilchos Chanukah, if he wanted to give a sermon, would have talked about the significance of Chanukah. And instead he talks about the significance of the Ner Shabbos, of the Shabbos candle. It would probably have been more significant if the Rambam talked, it would have been more, the more appropriate place would probably have been in Hilchos Shabbos, where the Rambam talks about the laws of Shabbos candles to speak about the importance of peace. Why did the Rambam choose to conclude Hilchos Chanukah with a mini sermon about the significance of peace, and particularly peace in the household? And in truth, the first time I saw this question was in the Sichos of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but I want to suggest a different answer than the one that was offered by the Rebbe. Now, it's interesting, the Meshech Chochma. I remember seeing it in the Meshech Chochma. The Meshech Chochma says that many Rishonim, the Ran in particular, explains the word Chanukah, Chanu chof-heh, that they rested on the 25th. In other words, the Meshech Chochma assumes, as to that matter, the Rambam, to a certain degree, that the war ceased or temporarily ceased on the 25th of Kislev. And that was, although there is some question about to when it actually ceased or the battles came to a temporary halt, whatever it was, and the dedication and the restoration of the Beis Hamikdash took place. And so the Meshech Chochma says, Chanu chof-heh. And the Meshech Chochma understands, says, do most Mefarshim, although there is an argument about it, as I'll mention later, that Chanu chof-heh means that they rested from war. And he says, the Meshech Chochma suggests, and apparently the Meshech Chochma, to a certain degree, had a pacifistic attitude. It's not that he did not recognize the necessity of waging war. Certainly the Hashmonaim acted properly in waging war against the enemies of the Jewish people, who did not let the Jewish people serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who interfered with the daily lives of the Jewish people. But nevertheless, the goal is not war. The goal is not necessarily victory from war, but the goal is the peace that is achieved after the war. Consequently, he says, Chanukah is to be stood but as Chanu chof-heh. It's a celebration of finally being at peace. And it's interesting, the Meshech Chochma also says, we observe Purim on Yudalit and Tezvav. The cities, the open cities, the cities that did not have walls around them, observed Purim on the 14th. The war was on the 13th. So why is it that it's observed on the 14th? Because we are celebrating the peace, the Meshech Chochma says. And the 15th, because in Shushan, which was a walled city, the Jewish people fought on the 14th as well. Consequently, the people of the walled cities have to celebrate Purim on the 15th. According to the Meshech Chochma, the celebration of Chanukah and Purim is a celebration of peace. Now, however, it's well known that the war with the Greeks, with the Syrian Greeks, continued long afterwards. So the question is, how could we say Chanu chof-heh? We said maybe there was a lull in the war. But I think we could suggest another answer. That until the 25th of Kislev, the war primarily was a war not just with the Greeks, not just with the Syrian Greeks, but it was a war with the Hellenistic Jews. But from the time of chof-heh, Kislev onward, the primary enemy was the Syrian Greeks. And in a sense, Chanukah was a civil war. It was a war between Jew and Jew, between the Jews that followed the Masorah, between those who were led by the Hashmonaim, and the Jewish people who initially the majority of the Jewish people who initially adopted the approach of the Hellenists. But ultimately, the Hellenists were defeated. And the majority, as the Rambam in the Ikros tells us, most of those Jews who adopted Hellenistic practices became loyal to the Masorah. In a sense, it was the restoration of peace between Jewish brothers. And we could suggest it's very interesting that the Torah tells us, Vayeishev Yaakov be'eretz megurei Yovid be'eretz Canaan, at the beginning of this week's Sedra. Yaakov dwelt in the land that his grandfather lived. In regard to Yaakov, the Torah says Vayeishev. Vayeishev means he dwelt as a resident. Where Yitzchak be'eretz megurei Aviv, where Yitzchak lived, comes from the word ger, like an immigrant. It's very strange. Yitzchak never left Eretz Yisrael. Yaakov was the traveler. But Vayeishev. Bikesh Yaakov leishev b'shalva. Our sages tell us, Rashi quotes it, Yaakov thought that once he reached Eretz Yisrael, he returned to Eretz Yisrael. Once the Haftacha HaKadosh Baruch Hu, his B'Shavti B'Shalom O Beis Avi, and I will return to my father's house in peace. So there'll be nothing to be concerned about. He will be secure. He wouldn't have to constantly concerned, checking to see what's happening. Yosef. So the whole episode, the aggravation that he had of Yosef took place. What's the idea behind it? But Yaakov thought that the primary issue of peace is peace at the borders. And he thought he already dealt with Lavan. He already dealt with Esav. And there was a peace treaty between him and Lavan. There was an agreement not to go over each other's borders, to harm each other. And he felt secure because of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Lavan in his dream, not to lift a finger against Yaakov. And Esav apparently also came to the realization that he has to go to Har Seir, and that Eretz Yisrael was the place of Yaakov. Even though initially Esav made peace with Yaakov because he thought that Yaakov will be subservient to him, that Yaakov will be his satellite, that Yaakov said, Adoni Esav, my master, Abdecha Yaakov, your servant Yaakov. But nevertheless, once Yaakov was given the name of Yisrael by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, by God. And the name Yisrael, as Targumunculus tells us, is the idea has Kisarisa, which was mentioned earlier by the Sorrow Shalesa, but it only took effect when HaKadosh Baruch Hu called him Yisrael. Comes from the word Sar, an officer that represented Yaakov assuming the role as the leader of the Jewish people for generations to come, as an Av of Klal Yisrael. Kisarisia became a Sar, as Targumunculus says, Rabbi, an officer, Kodmel Lakim, before God. V'manashim, and with men, and you were successful. So at that point, Esav, up till that point, thought, especially in view of the fact that Yaakov said, Avdecha Yaakov, and he said, Adoni Esav, that maybe Yaakov is giving over the Bechorah, the first right to him, the first birthright to him. And maybe the whole situation could change over. And Esav would assume his role as the Bechor. And Yaakov would be his satellite. But once Yaakov got the name Yisrael, Esav realized that he was officially, he assumed the role of being the Av of Klal Yisrael. And consequently, Esav, in spite of what he thought previously, left Eretz Yisrael, Mipnei Yaakov Achiv. So Yaakov thought that this time that he had nothing more to fear, because there was peace at the borders. There was no more enemies. But what Yaakov failed to realize, that peace at the borders is insignificant unless there is peace within the borders. And perhaps because of that attitude, Yaakov wasn't on guard about what was happening between Yosef and his brothers. Even when there are peace treaties, and even when there's seeming to be peace, we have to be on constant guard. And while this is true, there are two types of peace. There is the peace by when Lot left Avram Avinu. So it says, Vayifredu ish mi'alachiv. And the next pasuk starts Va'avraham. So the Targumunculus, the Baal HaTurim, points out Vayifredu ish sof tevos. Ish is shin. Mayal is lamed, the last letter of the word. Achiv is vav. Va'avraham is mem. There is peace that emanates from separation. And even there, you have to be on constant guard. How many peace treaties were signed and only to be ignored? How many peace treaties did Israel sign with the so-called Palestinians who committed themselves to turn over every terrorist, who after the peace treaties were signed, gave compensation to all the terrorists that put bombs in buses. So even when there is peace, you have to be on guard at the border. But that's a piece of separation to a certain degree. Of course, it wasn't the real separation. But when you have a piece of togetherness, when they're living together, you have to certainly be on guard. And Yaakov focused on the peace, on the fact that there was peace at the borders. And he took for granted that there will be peace within the borders. Kafsal love Rokso Shel Yosef. So the whole episode of Yosef took place, the fighting between the brothers. And ultimately, the fighting between the brothers was restored. And perhaps that is the connection between Chanukah and Parshas Vayeishev. Chanukah, it's true, the Rambam doesn't say Chanu chof-heh, but perhaps we could suggest, as the Meshech Chochma says, that even according that Chanukah is the celebration of peace. And the Rambam wants to point out, and the reason Chanukah is the celebration of peace, perhaps, is because, to a large degree, the fighting between Jew and Jew came to an end. And it's interesting that the Rambam in the Igro says the overwhelming majority of the Jews who became Hellenists at the end did tshuva. And he says, and we refer to them when we say Rishon b'yad tzadikim, we're not only talking about the Hashmonai and their original band, but the Rambam in Negro says we're talking about the Jews who had become Hellenists. But by the end of the war, joined the Hashmonayim in their loyalty to the Masorah. And to a certain extent, we should point out that, in a sense, Chanukah is, in a sense, the holiday of tshuva. The Bach points out that what was the sin that brought the Xeros of the Greeks, that the Jewish people were lax in the avoda. Not that they didn't do the avoda, but they were lax. It was the attitude that they had. Now everybody asks the question. We know the miracle, one of the miracles of Chanukah was the fact that the Pach HaShemen, the container of oil, that had the ability to last for one day, miraculously lasted for 8 days. But the halacha is that when the overwhelming majority of the Jewish people, why? There were other containers of oil, but the other containers of oil became tameh. They became contaminated. They couldn't be used in lighting the menorah. And only this one jar of oil was pure. And miraculously, it lasted for 8 days. But the question is asked, there's a general rule, Tumah Hutra B'tzibur, when the majority of the Jews become tameh, become contaminated. So the abode of the service in the Beis HaMikdash in the temple could be done in a state of contamination. So why was it necessary to have a special miracle that the oil should last 8 days? But the answer is, the miracle wasn't just that they were enabled to do the avodah. They were enabled to do the service. The miracle was that the Jewish people were enabled to do the service b'tahara in the most perfect manner. I heard from my father, actually the Beis Halevi brings it down in his commentary on the Chumash, that the Reb Chaim Volozhiner said, why is it that by Chanukah candles we have the main mitzvah? The main mitzvah is one candle for the whole household. Then there's an opinion, the candles equal to the number of people there in the house. If there are 10 people in the house, the first night 10 candles, the second night 10 candles. That's the mahadrin. But then there's a mahadrin in mahadrin. The most perfect way of doing it is candles equal to the different nights. The first night 1 candle, second night 2 candles. The third night, 3 candles. Why is it that by Chanukah candles, there are all kinds of levels of observance? And the answer is because we're commemorating a miracle, that the miracle didn't just enable them to do the mitzvah of Chanukah. They could have done the mitzvah of Chanukah with contaminated oil also. But God wanted them to do the mitzvah in the most perfect way. So, but the question is, what was the reason for this? What was the reason for this? Now, there's an interesting Maharal. He doesn't discuss that question. At least I'm not aware that he discusses that question. But the Maharal says that one of the degrees, the Gemara mentions, one of the decrees, the Medrash mentions that the Greeks made, it's the Medrash that mentions, was Kisvu al Keren Shor, right on the horn of the ox. In those days, in an agricultural society, oxen were very important to making a living. And anybody that had an ox had to write on the horn of the ox, Ein lanu chelik be'elokei Yisrael. We don't have a portion in the God of Israel. What was the significance of writing that? And the Maharal says that the Greeks wanted to remind the Jews, to let the Jews think they lost their ability to connect with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with God. It was to remind them of the Egel Hazav, of the golden calf. that as a result of their sins, the Egel Hazav represents the sins of the Jewish people. And the Jewish people, because of their sins at that time, in a sense, lost their connection the Greeks were trying to impress upon them. That God does not want to have anything to do with them. And consequently, it was the plan of the Greeks that when the Jews understand that they lost their ability to connect with God, they will adopt Hellenism and the Hellenistic religion. And in a sense, the Jewish people were scared that because of their attitude in the Avodah, their attitude, their lax attitude in the service of God, especially in the Beis HaMikdash, that God no longer wants their service. And that was the reason for the Greeks taking possession of the Beis HaMikdash and turning it into a house of idolatry. And in a sense, the lighting of the menorah in the most perfect way, with the pure oil, through miraculous means, was God saying to the Jewish people, I want your service. Not only I want your service, I want you to do it in the most perfect way possible. It was a message to the Jewish people. Yes, I accept your return to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to your return to me, your return to the Torah. It's very interesting. I accept your return to me and your return to the Torah. So Chanukah is a holiday of recognizing the acceptance that God wants us to do tshuva. God is accepting our tshuva. And it's very important. And what we see is that the Chashmonaim, according to the Rambam, let these Hellenists join them. You know, today we talk about the Baal Tshuva movement. The Baal Tshuva movement is a movement of people who were brought up unobservant and then somehow, sometimes almost miraculously, came close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And sometimes the way they act shames us, because b'makom shebal tshuva omdim ain't sad the gomer yochel lamod. However, and everybody has a positive attitude. Well, I would say there's no such thing as everybody, but there is a certain positive attitude toward the idea of a Baal Tshuva movement. What unfortunately I see is that people who were brought up religiously and then deviate from the path, and sometimes with one incident, and sometimes with more than one incident. And when they try to return, there is a negative attitude towards them. Chanukah is the celebration of the return of the Jewish people. Rishayim b'yad tzadikim. Why is it that we don't talk about the Mishyavnim in the Tfilos? We only talk about the Yevanim, about the Greeks. The answer is, I think, as the Rambam tells us in Nigros, most of the Mishyavnim did tshuva It was Mishon B'Yad Tzadikim, and the Tzadikim consisted of four Misyavnim. How can we on Yom Kippur approach God and ask for kapara if we are not willing to give a positive attitude to those who deviated from the path? So this is part of the holiday of Chanukah. The holiday of Chanukah is, on one hand, a celebration of peace, but the peace manifests itself in the acceptance of all Jews, of recognizing the tshuva that they did. If we don't recognize the tshuva, and the truth of the matter is, when you take a look at these three sedras, and these three sedras, it's tshuva, tshuva, and tshuva. Reuven does tshuva. Yehuda does tshuva. The brothers of Yosef do tshuva. My father said, why is it that Yosef did not contact Yaakov? He wanted to see that his brothers did tshuva. So he created a similar situation. And Binyamin in his place, when Yehuda said, "Va'abdecha ara v'sanar," I am responsible for Binyamin, the son of Rachel. He saw that they did tshuva. So the whole episode of the whole Mechiras Yosef focuses on tshuva. But the idea of tshuva is the idea of acceptance in Klal Yisrael. So that's part of the brothers coming together. That's part of the Jewish people in the time of the Hashmonaim coming together, recognizing the tshuva. So this is the idea of behind Chanukah, the connection between Chanukah and that. Now it's interesting. I mentioned that the most of the Mefarshim understand Chanu chof-heh to mean that the Jewish people rested from the war on the 25th of Kislev. However, the Bach feels that that's, I think it brings the Maril, that's a big dochet, and it explained the Maril. He says, Chanu chof-heh, he says there was a custom, and according to him, this custom existed from the very first Chanukah. It's not a halacha, but it's a custom to refrain from work on the first day of Chanukah and on the last day of Chanukah. Chanu chof-heh means that on the first day of Chanukah, except of course what was absolutely necessary, they rested from work also. Rashi says, you're allowed to do work. So there's a custom that women don't do work, either during the candle lighting, whatever it is. But there is a shita that there is a custom not to do work on the first day of Chanukah and the last day of Chanukah. And the Bach says that's what Chanu chof-heh means. They rested. And what's that based on? Now, I think there are two possible explanations. I'll only mention one now because, well, one explanation is that Chanukah is identified with Sukkot. We certainly see this in the Shita Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai says that the first night we light 8 candles, the second night we light 7 candles, the third night 6 candles. Beis Hillel says the reverse, and it's interesting. I should point out that the Miri and the Mishnah Berurah in Ber Halacha suggest that possibility also. That here it's not a real machlokus. It might not be a real machlokus. The Miri says it definitively. Mishnah Berurah suggests that possibility. Might not be a real machlokus between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. It could be either way is legitimate. And the Gemara says, what's the reason for Beis Hillel? Beis Hillel's opinion is that the first night 8, the second night 7, corresponds with Parei HaChag, with the bulls that were offered on Sukkot, that were given in decreasing numbers. Each day, one less. Shmini Atzeres, it was just one bull that was given. But why? What is the connection between Chanukah and Shmini Atzeres? Actually, between Chanukah and Sukkot. But the connection between Chanukah and Sukkot is that Sukkot was the holiday of this Meir, was the holiday of the altar. They circled the altar with Lavim, Esrogim, Hoshanis, whatever it might be. They said, Yofi l'cha mizbeach. As a matter of fact, the Greeks, the Hellenistic Jews, had a special dislike for the altar. Bilga, who was married to a Greek officer, a Jewish lady from the family of Kohanim. She took her sandal or her shoe and she went over to the Mizbeach when the Greeks entered the Beis Hamikdash, and she banged her shoe against the altar in a disgraceful manner and saying, you eat the money of the Jewish people give korbanos, and you do not help them in their time of need. You serve no purpose. In a sense, she was echoing what the Maharal said the Greeks were saying. The Jewish people lost their connection with God. So it's the holiday of the Mizbeach, the holiday of the altar. And Sukkot, we gave so many korbanos, so many sacrifices. And you had the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, which was celebrating the significance of the altar. The pouring of the water on the altar. Because of that, the holiday of Chanukah, which is the rededication of the altar, is based, certainly according to Shammai, is based on the Parei HaChag, which was the sacrifices of Sukkot, because both were the holidays of the altar, of the Mizbeach. And we could suggest that perhaps everybody wonders, why is it that on Chanukah, whole Hallel is said every day? Pesach, only half Hallel is said. The first day, all of Hallel is said. But we could suggest that even according to Hillel, the holiday of Chanukah is based on the altar. The holiday of Chanukah is based on Sukkot, the holiday of the altar, of the Mizbeach. And just like on Sukkot, we say all Hallel, Chanukah also, we say all Hallel, full Hallel. So, and we could suggest, as I mentioned before, that Chanukah, why is Chanukah the another connection? In other words, when we take a look at the beginning of the year, Tishrei. So Tishrei, you have Rosh Hashanah, you have the Aseret Shemei Tshuva, and then you have the Sukkos. What is Sukkos? The Medrash tells us you take lulav and esrog, adasim and aravos, and you go out. It's a symbol of simcha, of joy, of celebration. And the Medrash says, why? Because we believe that we were successful in our tefillas, in our tshuva, that we received kapara. And to a certain degree, Chanukah, when those candles remained lit for 8 days, that was HaKadosh Baruch Hu's message. I have re-accepted you. You have done tshuva. It's not only the Chashmonayim that are accepted, even the Mishyavnim, the former Mishyavnim, who have done tshuva. So the holiday of Chanukah is a holiday of brothers who are separated from each other, coming together in a similar way as in these three sedras, Yosef and his brothers who were separated eventually come together. It's very interesting that the David HaMelech wanted to build the Beis HaMikdash. And he told Yonasan that he wanted to build a Beis HaMikdash. It was after he finished he was in peace with the enemies around him. There was no longer fear of war. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, no, you can't build the Beis HaMikdash. Harbe damim shavachta. And David went to war primarily because of defense of the Jewish people. Nevertheless, I assume there was a fear that if David had built the Beis HaMikdash, the Beis HaMikdash would have been seen as a monument to the victory of war. And the purpose of the Beis HaMikdash was to be, on contrary, a monument to peace. And it's very interesting. The Yerushalmi brings a special Zeres HaKasav that a Kohen Meshech Chochma, there was a Kohen who was anointed, in a sense, to read the Parshas, who would go out to war with the Jewish armies. And the question arose, can a Kohen Meshech Chochma, a Kohen who was anointed to be the Kohen of the army, who gave guidance, who talked to the soldiers who were going out to fight the battle, could he eventually become a Kohen Gadol? Could he eventually be appointed to the position of the highest Kohen, who went into the Kodesh Kodashim, into the Holy of Holies, who pleaded on behalf of the Jewish people for kapara, for atonement, who did all the service on Yom Kippurim? And Yerushalmi brings a special Zeres HaKasav based on the fact that Pinchas, who was a Meshech Chochma, eventually became the Kohen Gadol, became the head of the Kohanim, who did the service in Yom Kippurim. And I saw that Reb Zevin asked the question, others asked the question also. Why is it necessary to have a special pasuk Why would I have thought that he couldn't be a Kohen Gadol? And Reb Zevin suggests, because since the Beis Hamikdash is dedicated to peace, you see that David couldn't build it because he was identified with war. And only Shlomo, who was not on the level of his father David, could build it. It could be suggested that the Kohen Gadol has to be a person who was never identified with war. Consequently, we needed a special Xeris Akasov to tell us that Pinchas could be a Kohen Gadol. Is Brisi Shalom, when he gets kahuna, when he's told he could do the service in the Beis HaMikdash, it's told Brisi Shalom. And it's very interesting. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah tells us, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah tells us that that when there is Xeros, when there are decrees against the Jewish people, so all four fast days, Asar B'Tevet, Sam Gedalia, Shilas B'Tamas, and Tisha B'Av are required fast days. And when there is Shalom, when there is peace, they are holidays. Sasam Echimcha, they're days of joy. When there's peace, so Tisha B'Av is a holiday. Certainly the other three fast days are holidays. And the question is, what does it mean, peace? What does peace mean? And there's a machlokas. The Rambam says that when Mashiach comes, because only when Mashiach comes will there be a true peace. However, Rashi and Rabbeinu Chanano, they understand that when there's peace, certainly Rabbeinu Chanano, that means when the Beis HaMikdash is in existence. And from the Gemara, it appears that way. The Rambam is somewhat difficult. The Gemara seems to imply that the fast days during Vayeishev, during the second Beis HaMikdash, were holidays. Why? Mashiach wasn't here yet, but the Beis HaMikdash was in existence. And the question is, why is it that the Beis HaMikdash is identified as Manshei Shalom? There were many times during the existence of the Beis HaMikdash when there wasn't Shalom. But I think the reason is because the Navi, Shmuel Navi, says when David asked permission, which ultimately was not given to him, to build the Beis HaMikdash, Navi says, Hashem heniach lo mikol oyevav misaviv. When did David ask for permission to build the Beis HaMikdash? When God gave him peace, gave him peace from all his enemies. When God gave him peace from all his enemies, it seems the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash, the requirement of building the Beis HaMikdash, is dependent upon the fact that there is peace. Consequently, the Beis HaMikdash is identified with peace. The Beis HaMikdash has to be an edifice of peace. It cannot be an edifice of war. Chanukah is the celebration of the altar. The stones of the altar couldn't be cut with metal because metal is identified with the sword. It's the holiday of the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash, the prerequisite for building the Beis HaMikdash is peace. It's the holiday of peace. But peace, part of the idea of Chanukah is that peace at the borders is a true peace only if there is peace within the borders. Consequently, at the end of Hilchos Chanukah, which is the holiday of peace, the Rambam talks about the importance of peace. and he makes a particular expression. He talks specifically, generally talks about peace in the world, but he specifies peace at home, because peace at home, if there's no peace at home, there is no real peace. This was the lesson of Parshas Vayeishev. Vayeishev Yaakov bikesh leishe b'shalva. He understood peace only at the borders. The need to be, he understood the need to be attentive, that there should be peace, was only at the borders. We cannot take for granted peace at the borders, and we cannot take for granted peace within the borders. We have to always be concerned that the peace continue. And this is what the holiday of Chanukah is all about. And that's the connection between Yosef and his brothers and the holiday of Chanukah. And that's the reason why the Rambam concludes Hilchos Chanukah with talking about the significance of peace. Okay.
If anyone has any questions, please put it in the chat. Okay, so one question. If Chanukah were rededicating the altar and our table and our home represents the Mizbeach, is the primary place for the menorah our table?
No, primary place for the menorah. First of all, it shouldn't be at the table anyway, because if it's at the table, if it's at the table, it might look. You have to think in terms of the way things were in those days, that it's light it's like candles at your dinner candles, and the Chanukah candles have to be expressive of the it has to be recognized as Chanukah candles. Secondly, there is a special halacha, maybe we'll get into it in future shiurim, of Presumei Nisa. So the primary place of the Chanukah candles is at the door. And when we can't do it at the door, we do it by the window. Why the Chachamim required primarily it should be at the door? My feeling is because it's mentioned that the Rambam in the Igros mentions a medrash, and the same thing is brought down in the Medrash Chanukah, that one of the worst decrees that the Greeks made was that no Jew should be able to lock his door, because they wanted to prevent the Jews from being loyal to the Masorah within the house, because the Greeks knew that you could close down the shuls, you can close down the Beis HaMikdash, you can close down the yeshivas, but the Masorah will continue in the homes. So to make the Jews frightened from from being committed to the Masorah in the home, they did not allow Jews to lock the door of their house. So a Greek officer, the fear of a Greek officer entering at any moment was there. Consequently, perhaps we could suggest that the Chachamim said, light it at the door, because they tried to use the doorway to prevent the Jews from the Masorah. We're showing the world that, on the contrary, we are observing the Masorah.
Does anyone else have any questions? It doesn't look like there's any more questions, so thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend. Mir Hashem next Sunday, same time.
Right.